the second mile. One of the most helpful of all success philosophies was given by Jesus in his story of the second mile. The people to whom Jesus was speaking were subject to a very unpleasant military regulation, giving a Roman soldier the right to command a civilian to carry his burden for 1 mile. This made a very disagreeable situation for those who hated their Roman masters. It must have been a double shock, therefore, to hear Jesus say, "Whosoever shall compel thee to go 1 mile, go with him twain." Merely to accompany a Roman soldier was a defiling business. To carry his burdens for any distance was unpleasant. But to voluntarily go even beyond the demands of imperial Rome was a disgraceful surrender. We can imagine how it would clash with American temperament to be forced to carry the burdens of an oppressive foreign conqueror. It could not have been less distasteful to the Jews. Over a half-century ago, Harry Emerson Fosdick wrote a very helpful little book under the title of The Second Mile. He challenges our thinking with many interesting applications for this important philosophy of the Master, which we might well utilize to solve our own problems. That is, we can also overcome the hates and dreads of life by cheerfully doing more than is required. To illustrate this point, we recall the interesting story of Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur, who was supposed to have been a contemporary of Jesus, was made a Roman slave and consigned to work the oars of a Roman galley. Ben-Hur's companions accepted their assignments with bitterness and hate, and as a consequence their naked backs were bruised and cut by the lashes of their Roman masters. But Ben-Hur adopted the philosophy of the second mile. He did his work as though his oars were taking him on a pleasure cruise. Ben-Hur knew that no effort is ever lost, and he worked twice as hard as he was asked to work. His willing attitude and powerful effort greatly pleased his Roman masters, and Ben-Hur asked nothing in return except that he be permitted to work on both sides of the galley, that his body muscles may develop equally. Then came the shipwreck, and Ben-Hur rescued a Roman tribune. Then followed the chariot races at Antioch, where those mighty arms developed in the galleys enabled Ben-Hur to master the horses, win the chariot race and his own freedom. History loves to record the names of men who in the spirit of the second mile have conquered the malice of their hate. There is an old Grecian story about one who was chosen in a joke to be the town's scavenger. But he filled the office with such splendid goodwill and helpful service that thereafter throughout all of Greece the office of scavenger was sought as one of great honor. Military service to one's country is usually not greatly coveted. But we remember that Nathan Hale glorified the offices of patriot, and when his life demanded, went the second mile and said, "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country." But so frequently our attitudes resemble the feelings of the captive Hebrews toward the duties imposed upon them by this hated Roman law. One of the best ways to avoid bitterness and the slavery caused by life's necessities is to enthusiastically give more service than is asked for. That superabundant willingness in life that characterized the service of Ben-Hur always marks one for greatness. We can glorify even the most common drudgery by doing it nobly. When we go further than is required, when we do more than we get paid for, only then do we get paid for more than we do. The second mile philosophy translates duty into privilege. The first mile may be drudgery, but glory always comes with the second mile. This overabundant willingness to serve must have seemed impossibly difficult to the Jews, and yet it is a basic success principle. The military might of ancient Rome has long since disappeared, and the hated Roman soldiers can no longer compel reluctant hands to do unwilling service. But the second mile principle remains an important factor in human happiness and success. All people live on one of 3 levels of performance. The first level is the must level. That is the lowest. Above the must level is the ought level. But the highest level of performance is the want level. That is the level of the second mile. If we personify some of the compulsions of our own lives, we will recognize that they are to us about what the hated Roman soldiers were to the captive Jews. Then if we can learn to apply the philosophy of Jesus, we will be able to solve all of our problems on their highest level. Suppose that we think about that part of the work of the world that we have been given to do. Frequently, there is a compulsion involved that may be as disagreeable and demanding as the heavily burdened Roman soldier. Necessity demands that we carry this heavy load for a long, dreary mile. If we accept our work reluctantly and go about its accomplishment like unwilling slaves under the lash of a galley master, begrudgingly performing the barest requirements, then, like the rancorous old Hebrew, with resentment in our hearts, we trudge our weary mile in the spirit of bitterness, while failure breeds poison in our hearts. 1 mile people are mercilessly beaten by life's cat of 9 tails held in the hands of necessity, but Jesus said, "Whosoever shall compel thee to go with him a mile, go with him twain." To go the 2nd mile requires a different kind of person. We all need some Ben-Hur qualifications. The 2nd mile man says, "My work is my best friend. It is my blessing from God, even though it may come in disguise. But even though it shows a stern face, it may be loaded with strength, courage, and good cheer." The 2nd mile worker greets his task by saying, "You demand that I travel with you for a long, hard mile. Then take off your scowl and throw away the lash, for I am twice as willing to work as you are to have me. I will go with you to the very limit of my strength. Only let me row on both sides of the ship, that I may develop symmetrically." When thus greeted, any task loses its frown of compulsion and begins to smile happily upon its devotee. The attitude of the 2nd mile saves the soul from bitterness and hate. It banishes weariness and makes one's work his very meat and drink. Then he wishes that there were more hours in the day. He dreams of heaven as a greater opportunity to work over a longer period. Then even the slavery of the 1st mile vanishes, and man and his task become good friends as they walk arm in arm to the end of the journey, and are sorry when even the 2nd mile is done. There is another kind of compulsion that in some degree faces every man, and that is the compulsion of limiting circumstances. Restricted personal powers sometimes narrow one's activities and shuts him up in obscurity. Some people are thwarted by broken health. Some are hedged in by that stern old Roman who compels us to bear the limitations of our own individuality. For a man of one talent to accept himself is difficult business. To noblemen, the most vexatious handicaps of all are the limitations found within themselves. It is so easy then to meet our problems by adopting the 1 mile spirit. We may grow surly, rebellious, and morose within our narrow limitations. Then we need to learn from Jesus the philosophy of the 2nd mile so that we can greet our limitations with a smiling face and make our own place beautiful, no matter how limited it may be. Fair flowers can grow in small places. We should remember that limitations are almost always blessings in disguise. Demosthenes became the greatest orator in the world, not in spite of his speech impediment, but because of it. John Milton had to be blind for some 20 years before he could write Paradise Lost. Someone said that Milton could never see paradise until he lost his eyes. The Apostle Paul was made great by the thorn that tormented his flesh. We have a memory of John Bunyan, glorifying the limitations imposed upon him in Bedford jail by writing that great philosophy of the Pilgrim's Progress. The spirit of the 2nd mile is exemplified by the young woman who wrote to her friend from her invalid's bed and said of her invalidism, "At first I tried to make the best of it, but now I am going to make the most of it." All men pay homage to these 2nd mile folks who go the first hard mile with overabundant willingness and then make the 2nd mile beautiful by their consecration. Then there are the stern regulations of the duties of our personal lives. For example, the 1st mile obligations of marriage can be enforced. There is an irreducible minimum of duty which public opinion and state laws insist upon from wives and husbands, parents and children. Like some old Roman, the social conscience tells us of the necessary minimum requirements governing family relationships. We must do certain 1 mile things, and sometimes we do just what we have to do and no more. A household can be run in the spirit of a miser paying his taxes, where the members are concerned only with the minimum duties. Then, when a stingy soul must give a quart of kindness, he measures it out in thimblefuls to avoid the risk of an overpayment. The 1 mile spirit says there must be no overflow of spontaneous love, or of volunteering any surplus kindness. The law says, only 1 long, dreary mile, and no one can demand any more. The unnecessary courtesies, the unexpected presents, the uncalled for thoughtfulness, the surprises and kindliness that come over and above what is required, cannot be enforced. However, it is this 2nd mile superabundance that makes the real home. Any man who has had a real mother knows that the glory of motherhood comes in the second mile. The real mother is faithful to her duties, but she is much more than that. She has an extra radiance that glows through her simple tasks, like a quiet dawn in summer. The minimum rules are forgotten. She has an ampleness of love, resembling the love of the eternal God. A mother's ministries go beyond the commonplace, and her spirit far outreaches the requirements of the law. What a delight is a second-mile mother, a second-mile father, and second-mile children. In the religion of Jesus, we see the greatest characterization of the spirit of the second mile. But even in religion, our conduct divides itself into two parts, the compulsory and the voluntary. The things we must do and the things we want to do. And only as the voluntary absorbs the compulsory does religion attain its fullest meaning and dignity. Until willingness conquers obligation, even churchmen fight as religious conscripts instead of following the flag as patriots. Never, until our privileges loom larger than our duties, do men become truly moral. To be a true Christian, one must be more anxious to minister than to be ministered unto. He must want to go the second mile, to forgive 70 times 7, to love his enemies, and make his meat and drink to do the will of him who sent him. The essential word in Christianity is love, and man becomes really Christian when the sense of joy in his religion overflows his rights and duties. The grim moralist doing his duty, or the man who is a slave to necessities, is not equal to him who has an abounding sense of privilege in life. Then we are able to say with the prophet, "My delight is in the law of the Lord." The Apostle Paul had the spirit of the second mile, when just prior to meeting the headsman's axe in Rome, he said, "Thanks be to God who counted me worthy of appointing me to be his minister." Paul's second-mile zeal took the sting out of death. The love that goes with the second mile is more than a solvent for moral drudgeries. It says, "Whether you are my friend or not, yet I am yours, and will always be." That is the level on which Jesus lived, and that is what he expects from us who follow him. Jesus said, "If ye love me, keep my commandments." Love is the fulfilling of the law. It makes everything easy, and it embodies that magnificent philosophy of the second mile, wherein Jesus says, "Whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain." May God help us so to do, I humbly pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.